Thank you so much for coming along, and I do see some people who were at the first talk, which is slightly concerning, but sometimes it's good to repeat things. And as Oscar Wilde once said, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. It's great that you've come along today and to be able to share in this presentation. One of the key things about Vincent Van Gogh is that he wrote around 900 letters to his, about 600 letters to his brother Theo, and about another 300 letters to friends and other artists. So we do know a lot of detail about his life. We can even look to a specific date, time, or event in his life and see how he recorded that and how he felt about it. And one of the key parts of this presentation will be the letters of Vincent. And if you want to know about Vincent, that's a good way to start, by reading his letters, which you can buy abridged versions. Jonathan is going to be working on a portrait of Vincent while I do the talk. So it's just to add another little bit of interest, and also as a sort of homage to Vincent in terms of, because the self-portrait was very important to him, and he looked very deeply into the inner self. So why are you here today? Why are there people who are still around interested in Vincent van Gogh's work? And why, if you go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam any day of the week, will there be a queue of people outside waiting to get in? Why, 129 years after the death of this young artist, are people still interested in him? Why, after dying penniless and in obscurity and having 14 people at his funeral, are there museums full of his work around the world? And why do people stand in front of his work and wonder still? He put something into his work that was otherworldliness, that's something that was beyond. He saw into things. He looked with the soul of the eye. John Ruskin talked about that we see merely through the lens of the eye, but we truly see with the soul of the eye. And that's something that we need to examine just on a day-to-day basis in our own lives, about how we look at others and how we see them, and how we respond to other people around us, even those who need help and those who are in need. So Vincent had a mission in life which was both preached and painted. He had a troubled life. His ending wasn't happy. He had mental health issues. He suffered from epilepsy, which he called the falling sickness. And he had heavy bouts of depression as well. So he only painted for 10 years, from the age of 27 to 37, and died in July 1890. So it's a very short period of time, and he did so much in that time. There was an intensity about his work and about how he saw things. So his life was a journey of a pilgrim. He was on a directional journey, a pathway that he carried through as far as he could. And he made us feel about the things that he saw. When we look at a Vincent van Gogh painting, something happens inside. And so his story is the story of a pilgrim traveler, and one who has come from afar, who's on a journey to a holy place, a place of seeing. And in a recent film called Eternity's Gate, which was just released last year, in an extract from the movie, when someone's talking about Vincent and his paintings and people not understanding him, he says, maybe God made me a painter for people who aren't born yet. Maybe God made me a painter for people who aren't born yet. What I see, no one else sees. I'm seeking, I'm striving, I'm in it with all of my heart. So Vincent was born on the 30th of March, 1853, exactly a year later to the first Vincent who was born. The first Vincent died at childbirth, and Vincent was born exactly a year later on the same day. And in some way this must have had an effect on him as a child, because his father was a Dutch Reformed pastor, and the first Vincent was buried in the cemetery beside the church. And so Vincent would have seen a grave with his name on it, which would have been his older brother. And that would have had an effect. So this is Vincent's father, Theodorus, who died in 1885, 5 years before Vincent, and his mother, Anna, who outlived her 3 sons. She died in 1907. This is the grave of the first Vincent, which is in the little cemetery at the church where Vincent's father was the pastor. And you can see the name at the top there. So a lot of writers have this theory about Vincent seeing himself as a replacement child, but that wasn't the case. He didn't have that complex or an issue about that. And he definitely lived a life, that was unique and a life of vision. My idea is that maybe he was trying to live a life for 2 Vincents, that maybe the first Vincent might have been the missionary and preacher, and the second Vincent would have been the painter. But that's just a personal idea. This is Vincent around the age of 19. It's, I think, one of the only photographs of him. I think it's probably the only photograph of him, actually. And this is Vincent and his brother Theo. And Theo and Vincent loved each other very deeply. Theo was his younger brother. And Theo cared for Vincent. He encouraged Vincent. He looked after Vincent. And it was a case of the younger brother being the older brother. He took care of Vincent. Theo was an art dealer who worked in Paris for a company called Goupil and Company. And Theo died in 1891 at the age of 33. And Vincent died at the age of 37. So they were devoted to each other. And it was the younger brother who became the older in terms of support. And he supported Vincent throughout all his struggles in life. He wrote lots of letters to his brother, and Vincent wrote letters to Theo. Vincent didn't keep Theo's letters, but all the letters that were written to Theo by Vincent were kept by Theo in a drawer. And Vincent's wife, Jo, saw these as very precious documents of communication and helped to preserve those letters. And Vincent was helped to survive as an artist by Theo, but Jo, Joanna, or they called her Jo as a pet name, had a really big influence on this whole story. And without Jo, no one would have heard of Vincent van Gogh, because all those paintings would have been dispersed. All those letters would probably have been put in a bin or destroyed. She kept them, had the letters published in 1914. And through her life, she organized exhibitions of Vincent's work. And even back as far as 1924, she was in negotiations with the National Gallery in London about Vincent's work, which is pretty radical. This is a letter, I think dated from 1924, and it's to the head of the National Gallery, and it's about one of the paintings that they have in their collection, probably one of the most famous Vincent van Goghs, the Sunflowers. And she's doing an exchange with a painting that they already have of the Postman, and she's reluctant to let this painting go because it's been such a part of her life, and she remembers it when it was painted way back. So it's a painting that she has kept in the collection of his work, but she, even at that early stage in 1924, realizes the importance of having Vincent's work in the National Gallery in London and other museums in different parts of the world. So she was really assertive about this, and she was thinking ahead of her time. So she was like a curator of his work who kept things focused and going, and a really important part of this story. So if you think about Vincent van Gogh being on stage, Theo was to one side of the stage and Jo was to the other, but they kept him where he was, and they helped to keep him surviving as an artist. And this is a quotation from Jo, and it's quite a counterculture quotation, because the cliches and associations of Vincent van Gogh are as this mad artist who was crazy, and that wasn't the case. I mean, he was a very intelligent man. He could speak, I think, 5 languages and write 5 different languages as well. He was very well read, very well educated, and a lot of that he did himself. So this is what she says: "It was he, Vincent, who helped me to accommodate my life in such a way that I can be at peace with myself." Serenity, this was the favorite word of both of them, Vincent and Theo. The something that they considered the highest. Serenity, I have found it. So she had a big, he had a big impact on Jo and that carried with her to her last days. This is a photograph of Jo with Vincent's mother, and this photograph was taken in 1903, and the young boy in the picture is Jo's son, and they named him Vincent after Vincent. This is the church where Vincent's father ministered, and this is a painting of the church that Vincent made as a gift for his mother. This is a hymn book that was found in that church with one of the first recorded Vincent Van Gogh drawings in the fly sheet of the hymn book, which was discovered about, I think, just around 20 years ago. So it was in, I think, a little storeroom in the church all those years. And Vincent would have done that sitting in church on a Sunday morning, probably when his father was preaching. And so he's recording, even at that stage, people around him and people that he found interesting. In 1875, Vincent comes to work in London for Goodwill's Art Gallery. And around this time, he goes to hear a preacher in London called C.H. Spurgeon, who was a very famous preacher. And he was known as the Prince of Preachers. And there's a period in Vincent's life where there's an 8-week gap of letters not being written. And it's around this time that most people consider that Vincent had this encounter with God, this new beginning, this rebirth experience. And certainly Vincent went to work as an assistant in the gallery, but ended up becoming a Bible teacher and Sunday school teacher in a church, in fact, connected with a couple of churches in London. So a big change happened inside Vincent. And so it was a step of faith outside the tradition of the church. And because his kind of view of Christianity was about living it and helping people who were less fortunate in a real dynamic way, in a way that Christianity worked by affecting people through showing love and attention. This is an illustration from a letter that Vincent writes to Theo. And he's 23 years old, and he's working with a Congregational church and a Methodist church, and the Reverend Thomas Slade Jones, who's a Welsh minister. And Vincent takes up posts as a Bible teacher, assistant preacher, and a Sunday school teacher in Isleworth. And the Reverend Thomas Slade gives Vincent the first opportunity he has to preach in church. So at 23 years of age, on the 31st of October, 1876, Vincent steps into the pulpit to preach his first sermon. How did we know that? Because he wrote to Theo about the experience. And we're going to hear that letter that Vincent wrote, I think that very night after he preached the sermon.
Dear Theo, last Sunday your brother preached for the first time in God's house, in the place of which it is written, "In this place will I give peace." Enclosed is a copy of what I said. May it be the first of many. Psalm 119, verse 19. I am a stranger in the earth. Hide not thy commandments from me. When I stood in the pulpit, I felt like someone emerging from a dark vault underground into a friendly light of day. And it is a wonderful thought that wherever I shall go from this day forward, I shall be preaching the gospel. To do that well, one must have the gospel in one's heart. May he grant that. God says, "Let there be light," and there is light. He speaks, and it is there. He commands, and there it stands, and stands firm. He who calls us is faithful and shall accomplish it. You know enough of the world, Theo, to realize that a poor preacher is quite alone as far as the world is concerned. But he can increasingly arouse in us awareness and belief. And yet I am not alone because the Father is with me. I know in whom to place my trust. Though day and night may come and go, I know the rock on which I build. He never fails who saves me yet. And come the evening of my life, worn out with care and strife I will, for each day granted me on earth, the air with praises to thee fill. It is a good word, that of St. Paul's, as being sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. For those who believe in Jesus Christ There is no death and no sorrow that is not mixed with hope, no despair. There is only a constantly being born again, a constantly going from darkness into light. They do not mourn as those who have no hope. Christian faith makes life to evergreen life. We are strangers in the earth. Hide not thy commandments from us, but may the love of Christ constrain us. Entreat us not to leave thee or to refrain from following after thee. Thy people shall be our people. Thou shalt be our God. I hope to preach on John in Mr. Jones's church a week this Thursday, and the Lord added daily to the church such as should be saved. Your brother was very deeply moved when he stood at the foot of the pulpit and bowed his head and prayed, Abba, Father, in thy name be our beginning. Your very loving brother, Vincent.
So Vincent had this new enthusiasm, this new beginning, this new life, which really affected his whole being, and he wanted to share this with others. That Christmas, he went back to Holland to visit his family, and his father persuaded him not to go back to London. So he moved to the Bornage to be a missionary pastor, helper to the miners in that area. That was a place called the Bornage. The nickname was the place of the Black Lungs. This is a photograph of a miner from the Bornage, which was taken in 1997. And this is a gentleman called Giovanni Rosso, who had his back broken in a cave-in in a coal mine accident 45 years before. So that's a reasonably recent photograph. And this is the area that Vincent went to. No one else wanted to go to that area. It was a place that people just didn't want to be there, but he went, and he went with nothing else basically but a Bible. And he would minister around the area. The miners had a nickname for him. They called him the Christ of the Mines, because Vincent went down the mines. He was like a miner amongst the miners. He tore up his clothing. He gave away his possessions to the miners. He would tear his shirts up for bandages when they needed help. So he had a big effect on these miners, and their nickname was, they had a nickname for him and they called him the Christ of the Mines. This is the house that Vincent lived in and where he had his Bible studies and meetings, and where the miners would come to. This is a very early drawing of miners carrying the coal, and he saw this as something that was an honourable thing, this idea of working hard. And this is a picture called the Bearer of Burdens, people with a burden. Vincent was very influenced by John Bunyan, by the writings of Charles Dickens and other writers who touched into the working class people's lives. And those writers had a big impact, on John Bunyan especially. So Vincent believed that the miners' lowly status in one way brought them close to God. That was a noble thing, that this idea of working hard and living just a day-to-day existence had a nobility about it, and it was an important part of his observation. This is another photograph of two kids in a house in the Bornage, and it was taken in the 1950s. So even like 60 years after Vincent was there, I mean, things are still pretty rough in that place. The missionary oversight came to visit Vincent in the Bornage and found him covered in coal dust and living in a small shack. And he'd given most of his clothes away. He tore his shirts up for bandages. And they were a bit upset by how they found him. And they said that you're being excessively zealous about your mission. And so they cut off his support. And he stayed for one more year and then had to leave. And Vincent left the Bornage and left basically the church. Probably never to put his foot inside a church again. But he still had this love in his heart, and he still had the love of Christ in his heart. So he moved from the preached life into the painted life. And this is someone that he looked to and admired, an artist called Paul Gauguin, who had an influence on Vincent. And we'll come to him later on. But he's now moved into this painted life, and this is 1880. So this is when he's 27 years old, and he's got a 10-year run ahead of him. And lots of things are going to happen inside that 10 years. One of the artists that really influenced Vincent was an artist called Millet, a French painter who painted French rural life and peasant life. And this is like a Millet drawing of a sower, which influenced Vincent a lot. And these are little copies that Vincent was making in a letter to Theo, pen and ink. But Vincent painted over 30 versions of the sower because it was an image that had a big impact on him, this idea of sowing the seed, putting seed out there. He did that with the gospel, and now he was trying to do it with his art. This is a Millet on one side, and one of Vincent's paintings on the other side. You can see like a major difference in terms of how they look at things. The Millet is very grounded in the earth, and very dark and very rooted, and Vincent's painting is full of light and almost shimmering. So the sower is obviously a symbol of new beginnings, new hopes, and a new mission in a church without walls that Vincent now found himself in. This is another version of Vincent's sower, and this sower is almost floating on a carpet of brilliant blue, and the painting looks as if it's backlit by this bright light of the sun. And so his way of seeing things later becomes very much intertwined with colour. But meantime, he's back in Holland, and he's looking at those people who live around the manse where his father lives. And these are like the working people who live off the land, the farmers and the farm hands. And one of the main crops in that area was potatoes. And so this is leading up to his first masterpiece called The Potato Eaters. He doesn't know it's going to be his first masterpiece, but these elements all play a part in that painting. This is the manse where Vincent's father lived, and this is a painting of the manse that Vincent did for his father. And if you look at the photograph to the right, you'll see a little low building, and that's where Vincent's studio was. So this is now in this studio space at the back of the manse, and he's starting to work on The Potato Eaters. He's 32 years of age, and the year is 1885. And now Vincent has 5 years left. And this is a letter he's written to Theo about the painting, about the potato eaters. And this is the painting, the potato eaters. I'm sure if you know his work, you'll be familiar with it. And he wanted, he says in the letter, for these people to almost have the complexion of potato skins, because they'd planted the potatoes and they'd harvested them, and now they're having this meal together. And even though it's a dark and atmospheric painting, it's a painting that celebrates people who live off the land, and what they've harvested, they're now eating. And in a sense, they're dining in a state of grace, and their potato supper is almost like a Holy Communion. And if you look at it, there's the light in the center. You can't really see it very well on that slide, but there's a little print of a crucifixion, and then there's a clock on the other side. So there's time, there's light, and there's the cross, and all these things are highly symbolic in this painting. So this painting was made for Theo's birthday as a gift, but Vincent was late in having it finished and couldn't send it in time. So we're going to hear now the letter that Vincent has written to Theo about the potato eaters.
My dear Theo, my warmest good wishes for good health and peace of mind on your birthday. I should have liked to send a painting of the potato eaters for this day, but although it's coming along well, it isn't quite finished yet. Though the actual painting will have been completed in a comparatively short time, and largely from memory, it has taken a whole winter of painting studies of heads and hands. And as for the few days in which I have painted it now, it's been a tremendous battle, but one for which I was filled with great enthusiasm, even though at times I was afraid it would never come off. The point is that I've tried to bring out the idea that these people eating potatoes by the light of their lamp have dug the earth with the selfsame hands they are now putting into the dish, and it thus suggests manual labor and a meal honestly earned. I wanted to convey a picture of a way of life quite different from ours, from that of civilized people. So the last thing I would want is for people to admire or approve of it without knowing why. If a peasant painting smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, fine, that's not unhealthy. If a stable reeks of manure, all right, that's what a stable is all about. If a field has the smell of ripe corn or potatoes or of guano and manure, that's properly healthy, especially for city dwellers. Such pictures might prove helpful to them, but a painting of peasant life should not be perfumed. Painting life is a serious business, and I for one would blame myself if I didn't try to make pictures that give rise to serious reflection in those who think seriously about art and life. I still have a few smaller studies, but you will appreciate that I'm being kept so busy by the larger one that I've been able to do little else. As soon as it is completely finished and dry, I shall forward you the canvas in a small packing case. I believe that the potato eaters will turn out well. As you know, the last few days are always tricky with a painting because before it's completely dry, one can't use a large brush without running a real risk of spoiling it. And changes must be made very coolly and calmly with a small brush. That's why I took it to my friend and asked him to make certain I didn't spoil it, and why I'll be going to his place to apply those finishing touches. You'll certainly see that it has originality. Regards. I'm sorry it wasn't ready for today. Best wishes, once again, for your health and peace of mind. Believe me, with a handshake, ever yours, Vincent.
So even by that letter, you can see how seriously Vincent's taking this painted life and how this is something that's really important to him. And it's not just about painting pictures or making a pretty picture, but it's about linking into people's real lives and considering, how they live, what they live by. And it's a very serious starting point. And Vincent then moves on from that point after his father's death. This is a painting he made after his father's death, and this is his father's Bible, the Bible he used. And if you look carefully, you can see the candlestick in the background. You can't really see it in great detail in that slide, but the candle has just gone out, which symbolizes his father's life stopping. And the Bible is opened up at Isaiah chapter 53, which is the chapter about the suffering servant. Father and son clashed. Vincent loved his father, but they had different ways of seeing things. And Vincent's view of Christianity and how it should be lived was very different from his father's. So that was a turning point in his life when his father passed away on the 26th of March, 1885. Vincent then moves to Paris to be in a place where there are other artists. He finds himself quite isolated in Holland. This is a painting of Vincent's boots. And even though it's just a painting of a pair of boots, these boots contain the invisible presence of a man. These are the boots that Vincent would have worn when he was in the Bornage. And these are the boots that carried him in his earthly footprints. They're evidence of his life's journey. These boots are the boots of a pilgrim. And these boots hold Vincent's direction for the future when he moves from Paris to the bright light and sun of the south of France. So we're entering the last stage of Vincent's life. It's 1888. Vincent is 35 years old, and he's got 2 years left to live. So he moves to a place called Arles in 1888 with dreams of new beginnings and the hope of setting up an artist's colony with his friend Paul Gauguin in the deep south. So like a sunflower, Vincent turns his face into the nourishing light. It's all about illumination now, and Vincent becomes addicted to colour. And you can see this portrait in comparison to the potato eaters is at the other end of the spectrum. It's bright, it's dynamic, and Vincent's looking out with hope. And he's now in a new phase, and he's calling down colour into his work and painting with a hand of fire. So his paintings were filled with heat, with light and colour. And if you stand close to one of these paintings in a gallery or a museum, you can almost feel the heat pushing out from the canvas, coming through the brushstrokes, as if they're backlit by some kind of bright, shiny light. So Vincent in Arles rents a house called the Yellow House. This is an interior painting of the bedroom. If you look at that painting and compare it to the Potato Eaters, it looks like the work by a completely different artist because of this light and brightness. And there's also a big hope in these works as well, and a joy in these works. And so Paul Gauguin arrives, and Vincent's hope is that they're going to build this colony for other artists to come and stay. And he paints 5 pictures around that time to decorate the house. And there are 5 paintings of the one subject, the sunflowers. And so Paul Gauguin comes, and they share a studio, and they begin to clash. They have different ideas about things. Paul Gauguin said to Vincent, "You paint too fast." And Vincent said to Gauguin, "You look too fast." So there were big sparks hitting off each other in a very small studio space. And that didn't turn out well. They had an argument, and then there was the incident where Gauguin says that Vincent tried to assault him or slash him with a razor. But, this is a painting from that time, and you can see the idea of still looking at the farm workers and the peasants, but this is a much more upbeat look and view because of the light. The light is really impacting his view of things. This is a lady who encouraged Vincent. And this lady was the lady who bought something that no one else wanted. She bought the one painting that he sold. And this is a lady called Anna Bock. And this is her sitting in her studio. She was an artist. She came from a wealthy family. Her father had a ceramic factory. And she bought a painting called The Red Vineyard. And that encouraged Vincent greatly. And so Anna was a really accomplished artist as well. And these are some of her paintings. And you can see an influence of Vincent in those paintings. And she liked looking at people who lived in the countryside and people who worked on the land. And she was an important collector. And this is the painting that she bought of Vincent's called The Red Vineyard, which was sold for the equivalent, I think it was 400 francs, which would translate into £16. And that's not expensive for a painting, even in those days. But she bought the painting, and no one else wanted to buy any of his work. So she bought the one thing that everyone else ignored. And that was a great encouragement to him. This is the first time in 10 years that he sold a painting. And he started to correspond with Anna and encourage her. She was going to go to the Bornage and paint where he painted and to see the places that he'd been once. This is one of the sunflower paintings that Vincent painted for his friend Gauguin. And this was painted in 1888. He painted 5 of these pictures to decorate the Yellow House. And when Vincent was painting this picture, he was fasting. He had very little money. Theo was still sending him 50 francs a month. And Vincent was sending Theo paintings to Paris. He couldn't sell the paintings. So it wasn't like a charity thing where Vincent was being sent money by Theo just out of, kindness. Vincent was sending paintings to Theo, and Theo was finding it hard to sell them. In fact, he wasn't able to sell them because they were just slightly ahead of the curve. So the symbolism of this painting is really high. Sunflower heads. And the sunflower really comes to life when it dies, because that's when the seeds are really important and when they can be used. And I was walking through Spain last year and saw fields of sunflowers that had died, but they were all looking the same way. The last few they had before they died was towards the sun. And a whole field of sunflowers all pointing in the same direction, waiting to be harvested. So this painting was painted in 1888. In 1987, it was sold for £24 million, which is a vast sum of money, and which I think Vincent would probably, be upset about. I remember seeing that on TV as a kid and hearing all these people applauding in the auction house at Christie's. And I remember thinking later that, were they applauding for the money or the painting? I think they were applauding for the £24 million and their commission. So in 1888, Vincent is at St. Remy, and he's suffering from epilepsy more. He called it the falling sickness, and his depression is becoming heightened. And he sold one painting, and Theo has just got married to Jo, and they've had a child, and Vincent becomes aware that he is perhaps becoming a burden on his brother. Around this time, Paul Gauguin and him have a big disagreement, and they split company. And the darkness starts to come in a bit, and Vincent has an incident where he slashes part of his ear off. And these are self-portraits that were painted at the time when he was in the hospital. And he used that time as a time to paint and to look from his window. And even though he was in a time of inner turmoil, his paintings were very clear and very bright and very accurate. And even though he was concerned about his temporal condition, there was an illumination in these works that went beyond the ordinary and the temporal into the almost realms of the eternal. This is a photograph, I think from the 1960s, of the room that Vincent stayed in. You know, obviously it would have been in better condition, but that's the room that he used as a studio. He records in a letter that the room had greenish grey wallpaper and a curtain of sea green. This is a painting he painted at the time of prisoners in an exercise yard, walking around in a circle and in the circle of despair. And one of the prisoners is looking out at the viewer. And it's this idea of trying to break through from that circle of despair. This is a pen and ink drawing from the grounds of the asylum where Vincent was. And he used it as a time really to make amazing paintings. This is the doctor who was treating Vincent, Dr. Gachet, who was an amateur artist and an art collector, and who had, I think, mental health issues himself, because Vincent records in a letter to Theo that he thought the doctor needed help. And that's saying something if, you know, a patient can spot that in the doctor who's meant to be treating him. This is a very famous painting, probably one of his most famous paintings, painted in the last 2 years of his life. And it was painted from the asylum room window. And if you look at it, you know, it's an epic painting for its time. The stars are cartwheeling into one another. And it's a masterpiece that meditates between heaven and earth, between life and death, between sowing and reaping. And it's the world at eternity's gate. And Vincent helps us to see from one world into another. So it's a type of preparation for the ultimate journey to an eternal home. And Vincent said, the stars are like a map to heaven, a revelation of heaven here on earth. So there's an emotional connection in this painting to be made with Vincent's internal struggles and for what he sees outwardly. So we're now into the last few days of his life. He's got 27 days left, and it's July 1890, and the melancholy is becoming stronger in his life. And he's living now north of Paris, and he's painting sometimes 2 pictures a day. And he's painting landscapes with vast skies. He's painting cornfields, harvest fields. This one's called the Little Reaper, and it's a symbol of death, but not a sad death. He sees wheat as the humanity of mankind, and that the sowing time is finished and the harvest has come, and the sun is flooding everything with light, a light of pure gold. This is Theo again and Joe with their son, Vincent, who they name after Vincent. And at this time, Vincent's become really acutely aware of Theo's responsibilities to his wife and child, and that he's seeing himself as a burden on Theo. And this is something that's weighing heavily on his mind and becoming very acute. The painting, The Cherry Blossoms, is a painting that Vincent made for Theo and Joe's son, who they named after him. That little child lived until 1978. He lived until the age of 88. He was a doctor, a physician, Dr. Vincent Van Gogh. And at this time, Theo is writing to Vincent, but Joe is also writing to him, and he says that her letters are like a gospel to him. They're encouraging letters. And Theo has written a letter to his mum expressing his concern about Vincent. And Vincent is seeing his tower of strength, Theo, looking shaky because of his other commitments. And Theo is starting to suffer from ill health as well. So these are the last works Vincent comes to visit Theo and Joe and to see their new child that they've named after him. And this is one of his last letters that we're going to hear now, that he writes after having been to Paris to visit Theo and to see the newborn Vincent.
Dear brother and sister, the letter from Joe has really been like a gospel for me, a deliverance from the distress caused by the hours I shared with you, which were rather difficult and trying for us all. It is no small matter when we are all made aware that our daily bread is at risk. No small matter when, for different reasons, we are also made aware of the precariousness of our existence. Back here, I too still felt very sad, and the storm which threatens you continued to weigh heavily on me as well. What is there to be done? Look, I try to be reasonably good-humored in general, but my life is also under attack at its very root. My step is also unsteady. I was afraid, not entirely, but a little nevertheless, that my being a burden to you was something you found intolerable. But Joe's letter proves to me clearly that you do realize that I am working and making an effort just as much as you are. So, having arrived back here, I have set to work again. Although the brush is nearly falling from my hands, and because I knew exactly what I wanted to do, I have painted 3 more large canvases. They are vast stretches of wheat under troubled skies, and I didn't have to put myself out very much in order to try and express sadness and extreme loneliness. I hope you'll be seeing them shortly, since I'd like to bring them to you in Paris as soon as possible. I'm fairly sure these canvases will tell you what I cannot say in words. I often think of the little one. I don't doubt it's better to bring up children than to spend all one's nervous energy on making pictures. But it can't be helped. I am, or at least I feel I am, too old now to retrace my steps or to long for anything else. That longing has left me, but the mental suffering remains. I was very sorry not to have seen Gulamin again, but I am pleased he's looked at my canvases. If I had waited for him, I should have probably stayed talking to him so long I would have missed my train. My money won't last me very long this time, for on my return, I had to pay the bill for the luggage from Arles. I have some very good memories of that journey to Paris. A few months ago, I hardly dared hope to see my friends again. Wishing you both luck, a stout heart, and a comparative prosperity. May I ask you to tell Mother and our sister once again that I think of them very often. Indeed, I had a letter from them this morning and will be replying soon. Handshakes in thought. Ever yours, Vincent.
So Vincent's becoming more isolated. These are the last days of his life, and these are some of the last paintings he makes. And these are quite profound paintings when you look into the subject matter. This first one is the Good Samaritan. And Vincent knew what it was like to be left at the side of the road, to be left unwanted at the side of the road. And the Good Samaritan was a really important subject to him. And he wanted to be like the Good Samaritan. He wanted to be compassionate. He wanted to be generous. And he wanted to be joined to others in their suffering. He spent his whole life being passed by. This is a transcription of a painting. The original was made by Rembrandt, and it's the Raising of Lazarus. And we're looking at this through the eyes of Christ. And if you look carefully at the face of Lazarus, it's a self-portrait of Vincent. And so it's about him rising from months of mental confusion to go and paint, sometimes 3 paintings a day, in these last days of his life. It says in the letter that the brush strokes come like clockwork. This is a painting called the Pieta, And again, Vincent puts his face where the face of Christ is. This is one of his last big paintings, and it's a hugely symbolic painting, and it's called Wheatfield with Crows. And it's a painting that really begins the start of modern art. It's quite a wild painting for its time, and it's got all kinds of things happening in it. There are 3 roads that come into one. There's a centre pathway that leads beyond the harvest. It doesn't end. It goes on over the horizon towards the sun. The crows are flying away from the viewer, so they symbolize this idea of restorative forces, where his demons are being chased away. The painting is also like a mindscape of Vincent's hopes and for his future. And so there are lots of visual signs that are scrambled up into this illusion of deep space. The power of nature surrounds us. We see a narrative of release in this painting. And Vincent sees himself as a pilgrim who is passing through this landscape, and someone who will progress beyond the distance, and who has gone the distance as a pilgrim. So on the 27th of July, Vincent is out painting in the fields, and he takes a gun and shoots himself in the chest. The combination of all these issues, his ongoing mental health issues, the burden that he sees himself being on Theo and Joe and the little Vincent, and his isolation. Although some people were starting to pay attention to his work, some young critics, Vincent felt isolated. So he decided to take his own life, and he shot himself in the chest. He didn't obviously die straight away and was able to make it back to his room. This is a letter at the top that was found in Vincent's pocket, an unposted letter, obviously, and unfinished to Theo. And it talks about him not being able to go on. And this is the gun that was found in the field near where Vincent was painting by a farmer. About 50 years later, it was ploughed up, that Vincent used to shoot himself. So it's a very sad and a very difficult ending for Vincent. This is the little inn where he stayed. He stayed up in that top room, very small space. And this is the room that Vincent passed away in. And in this room, Vincent passed from our time into eternity. And so in this room, eternity's gate would open for Vincent. When Vincent shot himself, Theo was sent for, and he arrived at midday on the 28th of July. Vincent and Theo spoke a few words to each other in Dutch. And Vincent said to Theo, his last words were, "I wish I could go home." So on the 29th of July, 1890, at 1:30 a.m. on a starry summer night, Vincent was dead, and he was 37 years old. In his pocket was the unmailed letter to Theo. He says, "There are many things I should like to write about, but I feel it is useless." This is the grave where Vincent lies, and Theo lies beside him. Theo died 6 months after Vincent. But in a letter before his death, Theo writes to his mother about Vincent, saying, "He had found the rest he could not find on earth." So Vincent was laid to rest in a small village cemetery on a height. There were 14 people at his funeral. The village priest wouldn't let them use the hearse because it was a suicide. And as Vincent's coffin was lowered into the grave, this resurrection experience almost happened, where once that coffin hit the bottom of that grave, his work, as it were, began to live, began to grow. And although this is a very sad story and has a sad ending of someone who died penniless, in obscurity, without a great deal of hope, it doesn't have a sad ending because his work lives on. And even in those last days, when his inner life was in deep turmoil, his paintings showed a joy, which is a very unusual thing. And as I said, Theo died 6 months after Vincent at the age of 33. Joe published Vincent's letters in 1914. And the dedication inside the fly cover of the book of letters was a quotation from 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 23. And it says this, "And in their death they were not divided." This is an amazing quotation from Vincent. It would break your heart to read it. It's really touching. Who am I in the eyes of most people? A nobody, a non-entity, an unpleasant person, someone who is not and never will have any position in society. In short, the lowest of the low. Well then, even if that was all absolutely true, one day I would like to show by my work what this non-entity had in his heart. And I think Vincent did that really well. For many, Vincent's art would reclaim what had once belonged to religion. Vincent gives us consolation for our own mortality, through the relish for the gift of life. He believed that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them. Vincent wanted to open our eyes and our hearts. His starry nights were over, and his bright new day had begun. His heavenly tendency, his hope of eternity, his grace exchange for all who look into his paintings help open our eyes and our hearts to see deeper and directly into the Creator's divine thoughts. This is an important painting in terms of Vincent's narrative. If you look at it carefully, you'll see the village, which is a French village, and you'll see a church in the middle of the village. And the church is not French architecture, it's a Dutch architecture. And if you look at the village, you'll see that every house in the village has a light on, but there are no lights on in the church. And so this might have been an unconscious warning or a deeper insight for us to see that we have a responsibility to reach out to others, that the church has a responsibility to reach out with the light, the true light that it has, to give deeper sight and deeper knowing of that great Creator. Vincent van Gogh knew the alphabet of God's grace, and though he lived a troubled life and died in obscurity, penniless, his work touches so many lives to this day. He said, "The human spirit dies in routine. Jesus Christ frees us." Contemporary writer Os Guinness says this: "We are not primarily called to do something or go somewhere. We are called to someone." And so the challenge of the church today is, for you, for me, is that we need to be involved in the culture around us, that we need to touch into the charis culture, and that we must not live an unexamined life. That is the most dangerous thing that we could do. The unexamined life is not worth living. No work of art is more important than the Christian's own life. And every Christian has a responsibility and is called upon to be an artist in that sense. We each have this moment only once. Like Vincent, we must be found seeking. We must be found striving. We must be in it with all our hearts. This is creativity at its highest, God in us. Vincent did so much in the short period of time he had. He gave so much. He helped bring consolation to so many people's minds, hearts, and beings. And there's something in his paintings that is otherworldliness, something that people didn't understand at the time, but that they're starting to understand now. Thank you to our musicians. Thank you to Jonathan, who made the portrait. Yeah. And the ending of this story was very sad, but in another way, there was a new beginning where the story ended, and that's in Vincent's work. And Vincent touched and hit the light in his life. And that's something that we can know through the truth that he knew as a young man. And he's left so much for us to see, and so much to console us, and so much to encourage us with as well. And for those people who are dealing with mental health issues, there are people around who care and who love and who can help. And there were people around Vincent who cared and loved and helped as well. And I'm so thankful for his life and for what he left us. And that's something we must cherish. And so even though it was a sad ending, there was a new beginning there. And even though he was the last amongst many people who were around that day saw what success was, he became the first through his work. So that's a great, great ending. Thank you so much.